This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight.
Welcome to the Nobel Podcast. I have Tim Mosso, who is Ivy League, Navy, and then somehow you transitioned into kind of like the leader of watches, at least for me, that if you decide that I'm going to look up a luxury watch, you have done a review on it. The first thing that you're going to see is your hands and you talking about whatever the watch is. Is that fair?
That's fair. I think there's as many paths to civilian life as there are people coming out of the military. And I definitely didn't envision wristwatch influencer guy as my ultimate destination, but somehow I got there.
I mean, I'm really interested to get into why and how whether you targeted that at all, or that was just something that kind of naturally happened and you found yourself in.
Yeah, it's something that happened naturally. And I guess the reason for that is just great advice I got from my parents when I left the Navy. You know, obviously I was public affairs and I trained as an aviation maintenance duty officer. So coming out of naval aviation public affairs with that kind of a background, there was no obvious path into civilian life. I was basically public affairs at an air base. So I thought, well, broadly, I'm in a communications role, right? And rather than just rushing into the first job opportunity that was available, my parents, we had some phone calls and hearts to heart, and they said, look, if you've got money coming in, and I did, wait until you get a great opportunity to do something you love. And while I was in the Navy, wristwatches had sort of been like a place of peace for me. Someplace I could go online, talk to people who were like-minded, sort of escape. And that online community was wherever I was. So I had a few wristwatches that I bought while I was in the Navy. I had a good job. I was an officer. I had no dependents, no debt. And I thought, well, for the first time in a long while, I'm sort of on my own agenda. So let me try to turn the passion into a profession and just give it a little bit of time for an opportunity and an opening to come along. So I wrote copy and ghost wrote for 47th Street, New York City used watch vendors. And what I found was these were very clannish and closed sort of ethnic relationships. And they didn't bring in anyone who wasn't family or kin, except with me, because I spoke watch. And what they needed was someone who could write to the watch collectors' language and interest. And so I just did that for a year after coming out of the Navy, writing copy, for watch listings, for websites, ghost writing for these people who were jewelers who wanted to now move into the watch space in the early 2010s. Maybe they'd been in the jewelry business for 5 generations, but the wristwatch thing was exploding back then, and they weren't really adept at that. Gems they knew, jewelry they knew, watches were kind of almost like a new frontier. So from the Navy, I started doing freelance writing work for 47th Street used watch vendors in the Diamond District in New York City.
That is an intimidating space, I think. That is an area that the first time you go, I bought my wife's diamond engagement ring on 47th Street because somebody walked me through. They're like, look, I've got a guy, this guy you can trust. And I didn't know much about it. He walked me through it. Someone I really trusted said, this is the guy to go to. He'll take care of you. And I think we did pretty well. But you go there and it feels like you're going to get scammed. Whether that's true or not, that's just the appearance. It feels overwhelming. They kind of want to overwhelm you. They talk very fast. They want a deal or no deal. You feel like the mark in a circus or something like that. And somehow you wrote copy for them and you spoke their language.
Yeah, and I learned so much about the watch industry too. I'd see a watch listed online on 3 different websites and realize there's only one watch and all these people are listing the same piece. I would learn about search engine optimization and how to write for the internet as opposed to how to just write an article. I learned about what it meant to find a watch that was genuinely in bad shape, and I became a judge of quality. I saw Franken watches made up of parts. I saw counterfeit watches being billed as the real deal. It was a crash course, and I worked 12 to 13 hours a day for some of these clients. And it was like wristwatch boot camp. It was like a saturation level experience. It's like when you're in boot camp, almost every minute of your day is either passing out exhausted or training of some kind. And I learned about Swiss watches, German watches. I learned about the history of watches, brands I'd never heard of. I went from being a person who was kind of casually part of the watch community to being a person who was now getting paid based on how well I knew watches. And I always tell people, if you want to do something that looks like it might be a lot of fun, you're going to have to run faster than all the other people who have the same idea. And so here's an example. I had one client who would give me $15 an article, full-length article, 1,000 words. And he said, write as many as you want. I want to boost my blog. I gave him an invoice for $1,500, and he could not believe I'd written that many articles at $15 an article. And I gave him an itemized list with a link to each one of them, and his jaw dropped, but he paid the invoice. So that's what you're up against.
So you wrote your ass off is basically what happened. Like you got into the industry by being a good writer. So let's start in the beginning. So we've already gotten to that. Anybody who listens to us your audience is actually really, really big. Ours is about transitioning veterans.
Yes.
So let's talk about it. Where did you grow up? What was that like? And we'll go through the military career, go back, touch where we're at.
Yeah, we'll make an end run, circle around. So I grew up on the North Shore of Long Island. People ask me why I don't call it Long Island, and that's because I moved a lot when I was a kid. So I lived in 7 houses by the time I was 7 years old, and finally the ball stopped rolling on Long Island. And it was a fairly normal childhood. I didn't really have a major military tradition in the family. Both my grandparents or grandfathers had been in the military. My father's father was in the army, and he saw combat in North Africa and Italy, but he died before I was born, so I didn't really have a connection to it. But my maternal grandfather, he'd been in the Navy, and he was the coolest person in the world. Now, I moved around a lot. Part of that's because my parents were divorced, so my dad wasn't always around, but my grandpa almost always was. And so...
Was on your mother's side?
Yes. He made a great impression on me. He was in the Navy. He had all sorts of things in his house that he brought back from the Mediterranean. He was on the USS Fargo, and I believe that was SEAL 6. It was the flagship of the Mediterranean fleet, and so he had all of these Persian rugs and Berber art and craft arts that he brought back from Venice. And just, if you imagine the coolest things you could bring back from the Mediterranean in the first half of the 20th century, that was like the living room, the dining room, every room in the house. And so almost every piece of art or object that you could pick up and move in the house was somehow related to Grandpa's service. So he told me about being in the Navy, he told me about training in Newport, Rhode Island, he told me about being just a little bit too young to actually see combat in World War II. So I would always ask him to retell these stories as I got older, and he was the most important man or male influence in my life. So that definitely planted a major seed. Of course, I graduated from high school back in 2002. I went off to school in New Hampshire. I studied political science. Thought I was going to go into law.
You're burying the lead there a little bit. Where'd you go to school?
Oh, I went to school up in Hanover, New Hampshire, Dartmouth College.
Dartmouth.
Yeah, I know, but...
An Ivy League school. So how did you get into an Ivy League school?
Well, I've always been a very expressive person, and it's not necessarily that I always had the best grades, although they were good. It's that I was a New York State debate champion. It was that I could ace an interview. It was that I could write well, I could speak well, I could think on my feet. And I think they were looking for someone who's a little bit more dynamic than the person who checks every box, and I was an interesting candidate. So, having taken a lot of physics and economics and, college-level courses in high school, I had competitive resume. But then I think when I sent in college essays that weren't about horrendous hardships, which seems to be all people ever read about in admission essays.
I don't know what you could be at 18, how horrendous it could be. I mean, it's some, sure, but not...
You'd be amazed. It seems like it's almost like one sob story after the next with college admissions essays. And I wrote about all these fun topics. I wrote about car stylists. I wrote about Indiana Jones. I wrote about, going to the Intrepid Museum when I was a little kid in New York City. It was a bunch of kind of fun flavor of the person type stuff that was in no way dour or self-aware. And I think that's what really made the difference. I was kind of a fun candidate with a lot of different facets, and I wasn't a professional student. I think a lot of people applying to Ivy League schools, they're like professional students, and they don't have a whole lot of personality depth to them, and they know what they're going to be when they grow up when they're 6 years old. I'm happy to say every plan I've ever had has fallen by the wayside, so that wasn't me.
Now, as you were going there, going back to what we first started, it sounded as if you've always had kind of an ease telling stories or communicating. Whether that being writing, talking to someone else, presenting, debating. Where did that seed get sown?
I would say I always loved reading, and I think that if you learn how to read, you learn how to think. And if you learn how to think, you learn how to speak. And you become light on your feet when you're used to telling a story. And that storytelling capability probably started early on, just making up nonsensical stories to tell my friend when I was a little kid. You could say almost a Tom Sawyer type of child. I would tell tall tales, but the takeaway was that I got very good at it. So that's kind of a talent I've carried through life. I try never to lie, but, sometimes you can take advantage and exaggerate without precisely lying.
What were some of the movies or books that you were into when you were a kid that kind of inspired that?
The stories I liked were always historical ones because I was aware even from an early age that there is make-believe and then there's real life. And, hobbits and sorcerers and demons and all these, I guess, fantastical figures that people loved in the books they remember from their childhood. I read stuff that was published by the Naval Institute Press when I was in 7th grade, and I thought that was incredible. I learned about the history of the world, dramatic events that shaped, the future, people who actually existed, good and bad decisions made by humankind. And I loved reading history. And for me, I understood the world better the more of it I absorbed. And the more you read, like I said, the better you think. And the better you think, the better you speak. So I loved books about history. I loved reading about the sinking of the Titanic. I loved reading about the development of ironclad warships in the Civil War. I loved reading about the development of steam engines in Britain during the Victorian period. And all of this just inspired me to read more because I found out that eventually I began to understand the world I lived in. And, I think if you don't know history, the world has no context. Things just seem to happen randomly and for no reason. And I think as a child, part of that sense of trying to get a handle on the world and not be afraid of it is to understand it. And everything from the Titanic to nuclear waste. My goodness, I read a lot about things that made me very nervous when I was a kid, and I think I sort of overcame those anxieties by learning more about them. Conflict, nuclear waste when they were clearing out the Shurham nuclear power plant on Long Island. I saw it on the news. It scared me a lot when I was in 3rd grade. And then, I'm like, Mom, I want to know about nuclear waste. And she'd get me a book and I'd read all about nuclear power. And I'd be like, okay, this is not something to be afraid of. And I think that's how a kid starts reading about the world. And a kid is like a top. Sometimes you wind them up and whoop, they keep whizzing. You never know where it'll lead.
Interesting. So you find yourself at Dartmouth. You say that you never knew exactly what it was that you wanted to be when you grew up and that changed. What did you go in to school, to college with the determination? You ended up in the Navy, but that you didn't go there. Right?
Yeah. Okay. So look, I was that guy who maybe wanted to be the professional student, but I was never in love with the idea of being a lawyer. So political science to me was interesting because once again, I'm learning about the world. I'm learning about how people shaped the history of where I'm living now and also places I'm not. And I loved studying that. I loved my college experience. But when the time came to come out of school and I went immediately to work as a paralegal in a securitization law firm that was issuers counsel to Morgan Stanley, Barclays Bank, SocGen, Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, and I was involved in the legal side of securitizing generally bad loans into bad bonds and selling them off quickly. And so this is what ultimately blew up the world in the fall of 2008. And I saw the whole mortgage scene in the United States from the individual buyer up to the investment bank implode in the space of about 18 months. And I was sending out scans of signatures on documents that allowed thousands of people to be evicted. I saw the lawyers, they were miserable. I saw what they made, they were barely keeping their heads above water with the cost of living in New York and all their debt. I had no interest in evicting any more people or hurting any more people or doing something that I found to be ignoble and predatory. And if I decided pretty much early on in my time working at that law firm that I didn't want to be a lawyer, I think it was really the crash of 2008 that led me to find, or at least seek, something that I believe to be selfless and decent and ethical and part of a greater good. And so I put in an application to Navy OCS in the fall of 2008. And initially my thought was that I was going to go aviation or intel. So, and I took the full battery that they give you, and I ultimately went into the Navy, and I had a lot of health issues in boot camp. I needed like a health waiver to graduate and commission. I wound up in aviation maintenance duty officer school. So after I got out of OCS, so I learned basically to be in aviation or aerospace management. And since I had that broad perspective on the aviation community, and after OCS, I was always at air stations in Pensacola and Milton, Florida. Basically, I guess just by chance, there came this opportunity to move into public affairs. And instead of being involved in aerospace management, work in a communication role. And I thought, well, that's perfect. That's something I know I can do. And so my naval service was spent in working with public affairs on the basis of naval aviation and naval aviation training. And I would bring tour groups on base, news crews, authors who were writing about the Navy, organizing events at Pensacola and Milton that were involved, with communicating the mission to the public, to reporters, public relations if something that wasn't altogether great happened, trying to be open and upfront about it, and also trying to take something that was incredibly dense and technical and inaccessible and making it emotional and appealing and understandable to the general public. And that's not all that different from what I did with watches, because at first glance, it's incredibly engineering oriented. There's a lot of money involved. A lot of the people and communities are difficult to approach, and it's not accessible. But if you can make it emotional, if you can sort of make it an article of endearment, if you can make it a hobby that is romantic, then you can enjoy watches and join these communities without being an expert or without being rich or without having any background in engineering. And so what I did in the Navy, explaining aviation training, ultimately became a great boot camp for the career that I've had for the last 10 years in watches.
So as you went in, you went in for one job, you transitioned to PAO. What were some of the takeaways that you did? What were some of the lessons learned?
I would say the one thing I didn't expect, because I went to what was at the time a Warfighters OCS. They had this other thing called ODS, where you would go for a few weeks, you would eat with a knife and fork. It was pretty civil, I went to OCS with people who were coming out of SEAL teams who were looking to commission into combat officer roles. So I thought, I'm going to be in like combat theaters, I'm going to deploy globally. I wound up serving in a non-combat role at domestic duty stations for my whole career, which is not uncommon in the Navy, but it wasn't what I expected going in. It wasn't what I signed up for. And so that was the first challenge. The second challenge was, how do I make my work meaningful if I'm not going to be doing any of that? And I think if you go in with the mentality, you went to BUDS, you knew you wanted to go into BUDS, you knew you wanted to be in a combat role. If you realize you're going to be working something resembling a civilian existence, how do you add value to the Navy? And for me, I sort of overcame that challenge and answered that question by focusing on helping people who were transitioning out. And I would say that of my time in public affairs, with public affairs, a huge amount of what I did was helping people who were on the way out understand what tools were available, what resources were available, what they would have to do in order to get what they were owed in terms of compensation and benefits and support from the Navy, both during that transition and after. So I focused on things like helping people who were coming out of the massive aviation community down in Pensacola and Milton, helping them understand what credentials they were going to need if they were ever going to be allowed to touch an airframe or a power plant in civilian life. To help people who are coming out of, for example, naval medicine, get hooked up with the credentials they would need to practice as either a nurse or a physician's assistant in civilian life. Also help people to understand that if you're coming back from a combat tour, a lot of these training bases they've got down there, they're populated by people who are coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, the Philippines, who have been on the firing line for a long time. And this is a decompression tour. But it may also be their only opportunity to get hooked up at the VA, get a disability claim, underway. Make sure that if you've got injuries, whether it's some sort of musculoskeletal thing, or you've got traumatic brain injury, or you've got PTSD, it's difficult to navigate health systems in civilian life. That's even harder in the military if you're still doing your job at the same time. And my goal was to try to make this as easy to understand as possible so they could make ideally one phone call to me and get a list of every resource available. And sure, there's a lot of times in Navy public affairs where the Commodore of Squadrons wants to pardon a turkey, or the commander of the base wants to plant a tree for the National Arbor Day Foundation. And, whatever, you cover that and you put it out in paper and you put it online. But realistically, I found out that for many people, the toughest part of the naval experience was leaving. And that sort of became the defining focus of my time in the service, helping them on their way out.
So I guess that brings, when you were going out, did, sometimes you try to, as much as you can, go towards something, not run away from something. Did you know what your plan was? Did you have a plan?
My plan was, first, make sure that I crossed the T and dotted the I's to ensure that the knees that I blew out and the hip that I blew out in the Navy were covered. I did a lot of running. I did a lot of damage. I spent a lot of time taking photos from a crouch as a photojournalist for public affairs. And by the time I was done, I couldn't run anymore. I still cycle. I can cycle for 4 hours, but I can't sprint. I can't hop on either foot. My knees are probably 50 years older than the rest of me. And I wanted to make sure that if those got a lot worse, that I'd be covered. So making sure I understood the process on my way out made it easier for me to explain it to other people, but also to try to protect myself there. And bad knees, that's kind of, low on the totem pole in terms of problems people have coming out of the Navy, but it is a quality of life issue. And I've never met a single person coming out of the military who didn't have some sort of health or physical issue for which they deserved coverage in a civilian life. That's a big sacrifice, and it seems like it's almost universal. People have health issues and they have injuries. Now, in terms of what I would do once I got out, initially I wanted to try to keep my career going in the reserves, but I had just a number of physical issues that made it difficult to get a naval doctor to say, sure, we recommend you for deployment. So it was going to be a civilian existence. And I thought I was probably going to go into television journalism, oddly. I thought places like NBC, Fox News, and CNN were the most likely landing spots, and all of them actually offered me opportunities. And I said, well, let me just take some time. Are you guys okay if I wait a year and come back to you? Let me see if I can find a dream job. I'm not going to be a different person in a year. My skills won't have dulled in any way. Would you give me that year? And they said, sure. I spoke to my parents. I said, should I take a year to try to get a dream job, or should I jump at the first thing available? And you got to remember, 2013, we're only 4 years away from a huge recession. Unemployment's still high. This is still not a great time. If you've got a shot, you take it. And I felt like I was maybe taking a risk, not going for the sure thing. And my parents said, look, you're in your 20s. You're going to have all the same skills in a year, and those opportunities are still going to be available. If you miss a dream job between now and then, you may not have that opportunity again. So take your shot. I went to 47th Street, I started shaking hands, and I took my shot.
That's such a weird place to start. I think people don't know what they like. And I think veterans more so than anything, because I talk to people getting out of the military on a daily basis. So I used an MBA program to kind of figure myself out. And I kind of like the Baskin Robbins, go try a bunch of things to figure out what it is that you like. And I think a lot of people from the military community, service academies, they go to great schools, they try really hard, they go, do things that are dangerous or in charge of really big things. And they're like, okay, what do you want to do now? They're like, I don't even have an idea of what I want. The fact that you went for something so esoteric, so specific is wild, because people want to go be consultants, or they want to go work for a big company and kind of dip their toe in. Like, you basically was like, I'm going to go hang out with carnies.
Yeah, I mean, you go to 47th Street, and it's a different world. If you're not part of the family, you're not part of the business. It's very difficult to get your toe in the door. And for the most part, if you're dealing with diamonds, which has long been the main business there, you're dealing with super high value things that can easily be stolen and concealed. So if you're not dealing with family, you don't know who you're dealing with. So there's a very logical reason for it to be cloistered, clannish, and suspicious of outsiders. It doesn't take a lot of diamonds missing to cause a crisis. And so I was able to work my way into this, and I was lucky because I was in New York for two reasons. First, it's where my family and friends were. Second, it's where all of the news operations were, with the exception of CNN, which is in Atlanta. Almost all the broadcast news and all the cable news is either out of Secaucus, New Jersey, or Manhattan. And so I was there because I figured that's my landing place. I'm going to be working in news as a headline writer and a producer. And that seemed fine, but it was also one of the few places in the U.S. where you have a massive trade in luxury watches day in, day out. So if I was going to take a chance, that was the place to take it. There's a lot of temptation when you're coming out of the military to do something that's exactly like what you did in the military, to take the first option that's available because you're worried about how civilian life is going to go, or to jump straight into some kind of school because the easy answer, the GI Bill, is at your fingertips. So to take like almost a gap year from real life, writing about watches, it was like a risk, and I was a little bit nervous about it. And I'll say this, the best thing that ever happened to my career was that in the spring of 2014, I interviewed with Hodinkee in New York, and they didn't like me. Something about me they didn't like, and they kind of stonewalled me for a couple of weeks. And in the time that they were stonewalling me, like if you're a veteran out there and you're listening to this and you're not into watches, Hodinkee is one of those focal point tastemakers in like the niche world of watches that people go to. It's like what Tim Gunn is to style, Hodinkee is to watches. And it's like this influencer, tastemaker sort of media vector. And it started as a blog, and it's still mostly that. But I thought writing for Hodinkee, that's like you've reached the peak of the watch whisperer profession. And in the time they were stonewalling me, I started putting out feelers to other opportunities. I responded to an ad on a blog, a vendor blog, asking for a ghostwriter for the owner and for a blogger for a company that sold used watches out of Florida. And that was watchyouwant.com. I went down, we dated, we met, we fell in love, and I've been working with that company in-house on a full-time basis for 10 years.
I think they probably would have wished they would have rethought that, but it ironically, you work with a lot of the people who were there then, and you have throughout your career, and you probably know everybody there, I would imagine. But that is still a niche. That is still something very specific.
Oh yeah, like for a watch guy, it's huge. It's like saying you've been in the Paris Review if you're a writer. Ask someone on the street, what do you think of the Paris Review? They'd be like, what? And I would have been like, what too? Until my cousin, who's a writer, told me about that.
Right. I just think that is such an interesting pathway to it. I mean, you were also probably the right place at the right time, but the path that you chose.
Yeah, I would say on the one hand, if you're going into a niche field and you've got a ton of specialized knowledge, you've got a leg up. On the other hand, there's also fewer opportunities. So, if you want to be a lawyer, you could be anything from a public defender to a Supreme Court justice. If you want to work in the watch space, there are very few outlets, a few websites, a few magazines, those are all dying, and a couple of vendors. So you really have to love it and be able to live it as a lifestyle. It's not something you can put aside when you go home at night, because to this day, I still find myself writing articles about watches at 10 o'clock at night and on the phone with clients who have a million questions, long after I've punched out of the office. So it's one of those things where in a niche, you've got less competition, but maybe the competition that is there is more intense because you're dealing with another fanatic. That's the thing. It's like if you want to be a Major League Baseball player, it's not a big segment, but it's going to be you and 100 other guys throwing 98. Like your skill in those ranks may not be as unique as it is at, say, like the high school level. And so if you want to make watches a full-time job, you're definitely going to have to out-hustle the next guy.
So you were in Florida, you'd taken a job after writing and kind of proving your chops on 47th Street.
Yeah.
What was that like being in Florida for, you were talking about the industry and writing about the industry, and now you're selling?
Well, first, I was in West Florida during my time in the Navy, and it was one of East Milton, where I spent a lot of time, is one of the poorest and most depressed areas in Florida. And it is very southern, it's very rural, it's very poor. There's not a lot of opportunities. And a big part of what we did at the base was supporting things like Meals on Wheels and food banks and social outreach to people who were good neighbors but very needy. And so then to go down to Miami, selling a luxury product, it gave me whiplash. Like this is the same state. There was like a cultural adaptation that I didn't expect. And it was like a tropical version of New York City. And it's just very different from the Florida that I knew in the service. So there was a bit of a culture shock. And also suddenly being involved in this world where you're in a room with 10 people and every single one of them can afford to buy a $100,000 watch. It's A, a little bit intimidating, and B, a little bit surreal. So to try to keep my head on straight while dealing with that, a lot of times I looked back on the perspective of kind of where I started in the state of Florida. So I was able to focus on the things that made watches meaningful to me, the talent necessary to make one, the richness of the history of watchmaking, the artistic value of the pieces themselves. And I tried to stay away from getting too caught up in the money of the clients, the glamour of the scene, or kind of the egotistical rush to own and have these things as totems of status. I tried to make myself a historian and a scholar of watches, not a carnival barker. And that was the distinction.
Did you see people who were competing in the space that you were in the same way, looking at it more of a historian of it, a steward, rather than I want to sell you a watch? I mean, were there a lot of other, Tim Mossos at the time, I guess, going the way that you went?
I would say no, just because most of what I did was online. So I created the online space for my company because I was originally hired as a ghostwriter for the owner. So anything that went out as a blog or an article or got published in a newspaper would have had his name on it. And I could work under my own name on YouTube. Hi, this is Tim of Watch You Want. Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watch You Want. And so that was sort of mine because they had no interest in that. And that was a space where they weren't operating. And if I could do that in my spare time, and I have to emphasize, for the first year, that was my spare time. At least that was a place where I could find my voice. There were not a lot of people at the time on YouTube who were not trying to be pretentious or play a character. Some people really ham it up, and I think we all know their names.
Probably the people listening don't. I do.
Yeah. I mean, put it this way. There are a lot of, if you remember Andy Kaufman, he was kind of a comedian who played obnoxious characters for a living. You never really knew what he was like, but you knew his characters were always provocatively obnoxious. There were a lot of people on YouTube who were in it, in the watch space, to get recognition and notoriety and either seem really pretentious or really obnoxious or really profane. And it was kind of a weird space.
It's really, really weird. The first YouTube people on watches were it was really weird.
And the strange thing is, you've got this incredibly refined product that comes from an artistic heritage and an august history. And yet the persona of wristwatches on YouTube back in like 2014 was actually kind of obnoxious.
It was terrible. I mean, they're like the people who are doing it are like, this is a joke, right? That guy's joking. And that was what was existing. And you're like, I'm not sure if that guy's joking. It's kind of funny.
There were experts that I had contact with, people like, Massimo Baracca or Matthew Bain or Eric Wind, but they weren't on, these were people who worked for auction houses, right, or ran vintage dealers, or, were experts in a specific brand or era. And they were very respectable people, but they were also old media. None of them were on YouTube. The people who were on YouTube, if you went to learn about watches on YouTube, you would get a video that was 30 minutes long where the watch was the size of like a finger and the person's face was as big as your screen. And you're like, no, dude, I just want to know about the watch. So I thought, okay, let me try to make like a 6-minute Motor Week style video about a watch, because Motor Week was this PBS car series. It was like an American, less sexy version of Top Gear, and it ran for decades and it's still on. I'm like, let me make a John Davis style 5 to 6 minute video about the watch. I introduce myself, it's 4 seconds, and then I talk about the watch for the next, 5 minutes and 56 seconds. Only information, everything I've got, show it on the wrist, measure it, done. And that became kind of my signature.
So I think in that space, which is really weird, is, I mean, you're absolutely the lead Google search of pretty much every watch. When you type the, if you figure out the exact model review, at this point, you've reviewed, you have like 10,000 reviews or something insane. So the first time anybody's ever exposed to it, they're like, hey, I would like to buy this type of watch. And this is, Rolex Submariner review. You're going to be really high up on that. And the more that it isn't the number one watch that's ever been sold kind of thing, the more that you get to like the third most famous watch, like it's definitely you.
Yeah, my idea was to get search traffic. Because the way I figured it, if you're on social media and you're just playing to the same group of people every single time, well, either the richest people in the world need to be glued to your social media, or you're not going to be selling a lot of products. So what I wanted to do was catch search traffic. Not necessarily the guy who's a super fan, but the guy who's in the market. So that was my goal. I want to be the first in every search. And I'm not always the first. There's a lot of paid, traffic. Rolex is always going to come up first on Google in any search of Rolex because they pay the money. But on YouTube, the second biggest search engine after Google, that's where if you type in a watch name or watch reference, that's where I rule the roost. My goal is to get the shopper.
And I mean, I think that's the truth of it. And I don't necessarily know how many views that you have. Like, I think that somewhere like you're in the billions of views for stuff, what you've seen, like what you've done.
And hundreds of millions on the reviews alone.
Right. And the odds of someone saying, hey, I like this one watch, I want to learn more about it, and you do it, like you hear your voice and you off the cuff, you talk about everything, words that I don't know what they mean that I've learned from watching your reviews of it. But the odd thing, the influence that you have over someone actually buying a watch is massive in an area that it didn't exist. And I'm more curious to hear what your perspective on was creating that and how much intent, because it turns out like there was intent of you trying to do that. What was that like? You saw opportunity in this niche that nobody else had. It's hard to get hands on really expensive watches too. Yes. And like you've touched stuff that's disgustingly expensive that like I'm afraid to be in the same room to touch because I shouldn't be in the room with something that expensive. And you reviewed everything. How did that process go of you looking to do this and then growing to have the ability and access to this stuff?
So a big part of it, goes back to the Navy and being able to take something that's really esoteric and make it immediately understandable. Like if you are operating a training base and you've got these sort of like turbine-powered helicopters that have a gearbox that drives the rotor, and if that gearbox detects that it's got metal chips in it, you get a chip light. If you get a chip light, you land immediately. If you land immediately, that could be in a Dairy Queen parking lot. People are upset. That's dangerous. Why'd you do that? Well, now you've got to explain the chip light and make it really obvious that it's a lot better to auto-rotate and get that thing down than to lose power randomly where there's not a safe landing spot. You might go down on a school, you might go down on town hall, you might go down where you can't get to the air crew. So there's a necessity there, there's a mechanical reason, but you don't want to hear that the machine failed. You want to hear that we're trying to keep people on the ground safe, we're trying to keep flight crew safe. All of these procedures are designed to preserve the taxpayer's investment, the safety of the operators, the safety of the public. And if you make that really understandable, all of a sudden you've taken this horribly technical naval business and you've made it understandable, acceptable, and digestible. And if you're dealing with a watch that is disgustingly expensive, like just this year I helped sell a watch, an FP Journe Tourbillon Souscription, 20 pieces, $3.3 million. I can't even comprehend that someone could just wire the money for this. But if I'm going to explain this, I want to do it with zero pretense. And that's the thing. I'm never going to build something up to the level where it sounds like I'm being pretentious. I'm going to discuss it as a watch. Going back to my love of history, I understand where Francois Paul Journe, the creator, is coming from. He admires the great watchmakers of the past. Here's how that's reflected in this watch. Here's who he is, watchmaker since 1983. Here's where he's been and how that journey is reflected in this watch. And then ultimately this watch, where it stands in the history of watches, to put it in perspective. I'm not going to say something like, if you don't have this watch, you're nobody, you're nothing. I'm going to say this is an important summary of the history of the watch industry. in the fashion and inimitable style of one of the most important watchmaking artists of modern times. This is a work of art. This is a historical document. This is a rarity. And if you buy this, you will be the custodian of it for someone else down the line. Now, there's zero pretense. There's nothing there that's going to make you recoil and say, this is too rich for my blood, I can't stand this guy. And it's the same thing when I'm dealing with a watch that is not super expensive. If I have a Tissot PRX 80, now here's a watch that you can buy maybe for a few $100s, there's a lot to love. You've got a silicone hairspring that makes it very anti-magnetic. That's important. If you've got a laptop with magnets in the keyboard, if you've got a lot of high-powered home and office electronics, if you're really into gaming, you might need that anti-magnetism if you're dealing with these high-powered speakers and electromagnets and computers. It's got a long power reserve. That Tissot, 80 hours of power reserve. 20 years ago, you would have had to have paid a fortune for a watch like that. The watch, it's water resistant. You could take it swimming. It's loomed. You can wear it in the dark. This can be there for all of the milestones of your life, college graduation, your first job, your first child. This may be cheap, but it's got real value. And I want you to find the value in the watch I'm describing, whether it is that Tissot PRX selling used for $600 or a $3.3 million historic tourbillon by an auteur watchmaker that freaks me out just to handle. I want the same level of awe and understanding by the time you're done with the video. And so I want to be able to speak to every part of the watch market.
I know what you're talking about because this is kind of my hobby on the side. But I think people listening from our end probably have no idea what you said and what those are and what those names mean.
Well, think of it this way. Let's say you go to a car show, and on one end of the show, you've got a Duesenberg SSJ. 2 ever made. 1 owned by Clark Gable. $25 million car. And then at the other end of the field, you've got a guy with an AMC Pacer. Straight 6, economy car, famously driven by Wayne and Garth in Wayne's World. I will find a way to speak to people who are in the market for those and make them appealing while also helping the person who is not interested see the value. So the guy who's looking at the Duesenberg, I will find a way to get him passionate about the AMC. And the person who's looking at that AMC who's on a budget, I will find a way to get him excited about the Duesenberg without being revolted by its price and exclusivity. And that's what I do with watches.
There's 2 things. You told me something that when you review a watch, you look at you never review something negatively in my view. There is a world that exists where there's almost a joy in destroying other things rather than building anything up. And I think particularly in this weird thing where you wear wrist jewelry that doesn't make any sense, that a lot of people have very strong opinions and they just destroy it. But you said that you try to show the qualities that somebody would go to it for. For example, there's people who destroy, let's say, a watch Hublot for whatever reason. It is cool on the internet to destroy that brand, but there's a reason that people like it, and it's okay to like it. There's no reason not to. And you're gonna show the qualities that somebody who would go to it with.
Yeah. So this is, look at it in terms of the Navy. As a division officer, you might just be an ensign. You're not a very senior person, and yet every enlisted seaman underneath you, even if they've been in for 10 years, they're your responsibility. Now, let's say one of them gets called before the captain, and now he's at risk of losing a chevron. So he's facing a demotion because of something he did wrong. Now, obviously, there could be a million things wrong with this guy. He may have many vices, but he also has many virtues. And you're not going to lie, because that's not what you do, and that's wrong. But you're going to try to show him in the best possible light. You're going to say, this is a guy who is devoted to his teammates, who works hard for his family. When you inspected our division, you remember that beautifully polished combobulator that you complimented, Captain? Well, guess who polished the combobulator? And I'm going to bring out the best features of this person because there's something good about everyone. And I believe that there's something good about every watch. We don't sell junk watches. If a watch is counterfeit, if it's what they call a Franken watch made up of the wrong parts, if it's stolen or black market, we don't sell that kind of watch. So we don't sell bad, wrong, or slipshod watches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a watch that maybe people like to tear into, like an Hublot Big Bang. Why? Because, the general idea is that maybe Hublot's appeal to collectors is superficial, that its brand built more on style than substance, that a lot of their celebrity ambassadors are kind of self-aware and obnoxious, and, that there are watches made in the same style, like a Royal Oak Offshore from Audemars Piguet. Now this is blue blood, this is tradition, this is quality, this is legitimate. I'm going to say, well, first of all, aren't watches supposed to be fun? This Hublot is fun. This is not a watch that's beautifully built by an artist working in an attic in a cottage in the mountains of Switzerland. I'm not going to pretend it's that, but it's very durable. It's very reliable. You'll never have trouble getting parts in service. This will last a lifetime. You can still pass this down to your kid. And while it is silly, it's also silly fun. And if we start taking luxury watches so seriously that we decide there's a right $15,000 watch and a wrong $15,000 watch, then we've completely lost our perspective on life. So I'm going to be an advocate for that watch. I'm not going to claim it's something it isn't, but I'm going to bring out the best features to show it in the best possible light. That's how I review a watch. Act as the advocate for the watch. Not a liar, but focus on the positives.
So the thing that I find interesting is that you speak a language and you are perhaps the most proficient at that language of anybody I've ever heard. And one of the difficulties that I think that I had, and that a lot of people probably that I'm trying to pitch this to, is leaving one life and starting another. And so the identity that you have tied to the military is sometimes difficult to break. You're many years removed, but somehow you went from, you can still speak the language and we're sitting here today talking about it, and that's still a part of you, but you are now the leader of a different language. And I would argue the best that I have ever heard, a savant in terms of watches. You have forgotten more about watches than almost any of everybody will ever know. How do you go from one to the other? Is it just passion?
Well, I think one of the challenges when you're transitioning out of the military is trying to create a concept of yourself that doesn't involve the military. You were a Navy SEAL. Now, you're always a Navy SEAL in a way, but you're no longer officially part of your SEAL team.
Washed up.
You're giving away a lot of what was your identity and your concept of self. If you were a chief in the Navy, then you were an expert. You were the last word in engines, electronics, weapons, rigging parachutes, but you were an expert in something. You were looked up to by your enlisted men. You trained them. And all of a sudden, that's gone. And you got to get a certification just to touch an HVAC system when you've been working on that for 20 years in the military. That's a difficult thing to grasp and to accept. And losing your professional identity can be really traumatic because you ask, who am I going to become? So what I think you need to do is you need to ask, who am I underneath that rate or that rank? And if you're a problem solver who loves machines, start thinking about cars, start thinking about diesel, start thinking about aircraft, start thinking about marine, or start thinking about taking it to the next level and maybe looking into an engineering school. Or if you're coming out of naval healthcare, if you're a hospital corpsman, healthcare is huge. You're not going to be a hospital corpsman anymore, but your skills have value. Talk to somebody, in Navy Cool, naval credentialing online or through that system to figure out what you need to get to continue that career. Or maybe you're a hospital corpsman and you're interested in becoming a doctor. Think about how you could make that transition. You're going to lose the rate, you're going to lose the rank, but you're fundamentally the same person. I had a friend who was a winchman on helicopters down in Florida. He was in the Coast Guard. And when he got out, he still wanted to be in public service. He was a compassionate person with a ton of patience, attention to detail, intelligence, and energy. And he decided that he wanted to become a Seattle city fireman. And so there's not a whole lot of crossover between operating a winch on an airplane and steering the back end of a hook and ladder. But his commitment to service was sort of the core of his self-image and how he saw himself. He was fundamentally a compassionate person and a helper, and that was the outlet that he found. So ask, who am I underneath the rate and the rank? What do I value? And then come up with some scenarios. I am a storyteller. So What is going to be the easiest option? The easiest option, call up some people who are very veteran friendly at cable news, like Fox News in New York City or MSNBC or CNN down in Atlanta.
Not Hodinky.
Yeah, well, definitely not Hodinky. But, ask them what opportunities are available for veterans. They're going to give you something. It may not be what you want. It may be at a bureau that's in the middle of North Dakota. You may have to accept some sacrifices. But for me, that was the obvious landing point. Go straight into communication at a place that was very veteran friendly and like cable or broadcast news. Then, there's maybe the intermediate where, okay, it's going to take a bit more energy if I want to go back to school. I'm going to have to probably take tests and study again for the first time in a decade. I'm going to have to pass the bar and be admitted. I'm going to have to interview and get recommendations. So that's maybe a more challenging intermediate goal. Go back to school. And then the reach, it's like when you apply to college, you've got your safety, you've got your middle of the market, and then you've got your reach. The reach is the dream job. Not what do you think you can do, but what would you love to do? In your wildest dreams, what would you love to do? Take your shot. Sometimes you don't get another one. It's like if you can throw the ball 100 miles an hour coming out of high school, it would behoove you to at least listen to some of the scouts about what your options are, because you're not going to be able to go back and do this when you're 35. So coming out of the Navy, you're going to have the opportunity to reset your whole life. They're going to move you wherever you want. They're going to hook you up with resources to get in touch with employers. You're going to be a very marketable proposition, but that only lasts so long as you're current, as long as you're recently departed from the military. If you've got a dream that you want to pursue, the best time to do that is right out of the service. If it doesn't work out, fall back to your expected, going back to school. That's sort of like the middle goal. And if you really feel like after a year and a half, it's not working out, maybe you're not ready to go back to school, then, take a safety job at a place that's very veteran friendly, just so you can have a work history. The most important thing, if you want to get a job, is proving that you have a job. And so that safety option coming out of the military is to take a job where you can get it and maintain a work history unbroken.
That being said, you went from Florida, and then the company kind of grew, and I'm interested in some behind the scenes. So you ended up at a venture-backed company that grew and grew and grew, and you got gobbled up. What have been some of the high points of that? You've been all over the world. You talk to really interesting people. What have been some moments in your career by becoming an expert, maybe the expert on, at least on YouTube? What have been some things where you're like, I don't believe this is real?
Well, I would say when I first got to work on watches, actually hold them in my hand, take them apart, and I was trusted enough to start taking movements apart, that to me was, all of a sudden, I've gone from being a teller of tales to a doer. And having those skills, even in the most rudimentary form, and taking that step towards watchmaking, that was kind of an awe-inspiring moment for me. I would say that having the opportunity to travel to East Asia and Europe and the Middle East, I traveled more in the watch industry than I did in the Navy. Remember, I worked at shore stations, domestically stationed. I joined the Navy and I saw West Florida. I joined the watch industry and I saw the world, and it wasn't supposed to work that way. So meeting people who've grown up with a perspective and a life and customs and cultures unlike anything I've encountered was an eye-opening experience. Because coming from New York and then living in Miami, you think I'm a pretty worldly guy, I see all these people coming and going from all over the world. Very different to go there. And meeting people I deeply respect and earning their trust. People like Denis Flageolet of De Bethune, a brand I adore and a watchmaker I idolize. And people that I respect in media, like Joe Thompson, who used to be the editor-in-chief of IW Magazine. Those people all helped me to, I guess, find a sense of awe in what I was doing, because new experiences, being acknowledged by people you've admired, and being trusted to move from, YouTube entertainer to taking the first steps towards being a watchmaker, those have been the highlights. And then there's one more thing, which is taking my original crew from Florida and trying to keep as much of that together through every iteration of this company across several states in 10 years.
I think that your authentic passion for it is probably the most telling, that because I think that you've probably been exposed to incredible people of all facets of life, but you just named people who are in the industry that you pursue. You were talking about the enjoyment of what it is, even within your own company. I mean, there's like celebrities who, venture back that. I don't know whether they show up or you've ever seen them. You travel the world. I'm sure that you could be starstruck by, famous people from sports or, company founders, because they go to those things. I'm sure you've met a ton of those people, but you named people in the industry that, the audience doesn't know. You're not saying, the famous, like famous watch fans like John Mayer or whoever. Like, I don't know, like celebrities that also like watches, I suppose.
Yeah, the people I'm in awe of are people I've admired, like James Dowling. This is a person who shaped my perception of watch collecting almost from the time I was in high school. I met him in 2019 at Dubai Watch Week. He's a cantankerous old man.
He's not nice.
I like him. I mean, you know what? The first thing he did was he called me out on stage and tried to stump me when I was in front of an audience of like 100 people. And, I barked back at him. I'm like, no, that's exactly the same thing as zirconium oxide, sir. They're not two different materials. And then afterwards, he's like, hi, I'm James Dowling. I'm like, oh my God, you're one of my idols. And, you talk about some of these people that are celebrities or billionaires or, folks you see on the news or in sports stadiums. And I've met them, and the leveler has been the watches. I meet Michael Strahan. He's an investor. He's a mega celebrity. He's a very successful and wealthy businessman. But he comes into my office, and I explain to him my process for taking watches from the portrayal stage to the sales stage using entirely new media and online platforms. And now we're talking the same language because he's into watches and he's an investor, and I'm into watches and I'm trying to make his investment valuable. And there's absolutely no sense of being overawed. There's respect, but it's not like I'm seeing stars. Every time I've encountered people like him or Pro Bowlers or, playoff grade baseball players.
Who are some of the people that, you just named one and he's an investor and he's done, I don't know, did you do a podcast with him? I don't remember whether that, but like, who are other people that are involved? Because just even your company, 1916, is venture backed with like famous athletes. I think, isn't Michael Jordan one of them too?
Yeah.
Have you ever met him?
Yeah, I met him. And again, just a polite exchange on the topic of watches, not like, can you sign my basketball? And there's a respect there. If you know someone and you're speaking their language in a way that's non-self-serving and of mutual interest, you can easily carry on a conversation like two normal human beings. And, I can't even like disclose some of the billionaires you see on like MSNBC who I've worked with. But if it's like, okay, sir, like I'm impressed that you've built a multi-billion-dollar tech company, and you're impressed that I know how to set your perpetual calendar. Like we're on an even footing. So I've never had that experience of seeing stars to the point where I felt like suddenly I was trying to play a role, live up to what I hoped they would think I am. It was enough to be Tim Mosso, the watch guy.
Is there anything else of your career that you want to share, kind of the idea from transitioning veterans?
I would say if you're a transitioning veteran, the first and most important thing is to know your rights. A lot of people leave and they're hurt, they're sick, they have lingering effects of their service, and they are not properly covered. Make sure you know your rights. Speak to a navigator in military medicine who can let you know how the process works and how to get it started. If you know you've got some sort of a physical condition or a health condition, there is a integrated disability evaluation system that allows you to get your military disability rating and your VA rating at the same time while you're still in the service. So when you leave, you won't have to go through duplicative doctors, duplicative appointments, try to explain your conditions again and again to doctors who've never met you. Do it once through IDES if you can, but you're going to have to speak to someone in military medicine who understands the process. If you have a specific skill, make sure that the military pays you to get the civilian credential that's equivalent before you're out of the service, because you lose a lot of those opportunities once you're done. And if you're afraid of what life looks like on the outside, and that could be someone who maybe was in for 18 months, or a chief who's been in for 30 years. Have a plan. Think of the dream job. Attack that first. Figure out what your likely mid-range landing spot would be. For a lot of people, that is to get your, civilian credential equivalent and work in your rate as a civilian, or go back to school. And then think of a safety. And a safety is usually a very veteran-friendly company that'll give you an opportunity to start probably in an entry-level position. But there are so many companies that are veteran-friendly around this country. You should be able to find a way to maintain a work history coming out. You've got a lot of opportunities. Your skills are valuable. Know what you do well and set a safety, intermediate, and reach goal for who you want to be when you leave. And also remember, no one coming out of the military, in the broad scheme of things, is that old. Even admirals generally aren't 70, 80 years old. You could be a chief, you've been in since you were 18, you're not an old man. You could be a commander, you're getting out, you're not an old man. People live a lot of lives and they can have a lot of careers. So if you don't like who you were in the military or you're ready to move on, still have a plan, but don't think you're too old or too far down any road to turn the page.
Awesome. So I'm going to put you on the spot for some speed questions. What are 3, and you could give a number, favorite movies, favorite books? If you do like 3 each or like 3 total, that'd be good. And what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given? And we'll end there.
The best piece of advice I've ever been given, my 5th grade teacher told me to work smart, not hard. And he explained it this way. You can try to knock down a door with your forehead, or you can turn the knob. Your choice. And that was my early lesson in the idea that you can get great results with a little bit of ingenuity, and you don't have to necessarily exhaust yourself to get there. Work smart, not hard.
Okay.
And then when I got out of the Navy, my parents told me, shoot for your dreams. I know it's a cliche, but if you shoot for the stars, you land on the moon. And they told me, if you've got money coming in and you've got a fallback plan, shoot for the dream job. I did, and it worked. So that was the best advice I've ever had. In terms of movies, this is the easy one. I would say, in no particular order, I can give you more than 3. My favorite would be Vanishing Point, The Fifth Element, Evil Dead 2, Back to the Future, and Indiana Jones.
There's no explanation needed. I love it. What about some books?
Let's go with a fictional work, 'cause most people relate to that more than nonfiction stuff. The Once and Future King by T.H. White. And I read it when I was a teenager, and it was hard to start because it was written in this really sort of lavish, pseudo-antiquated language. It was about the story of King Arthur. And so it was kind of written in difficult language, and I'm not into fantasy and wizards and sorcerers and fantastic tales, but it wasn't really about any of that. It was about what it means to have integrity as a person, what it means to be disillusioned coming of age from childhood to adulthood, what it means to make a moral choice between good and evil, what it means to understand compassion versus cruelty. There's so much in it. So The Once and Future King. Also, I loved, when I was a kid, this book called Axis and Neutral Battleships of World War II. And it was this monster 700-page readout from the Naval Institute Press, which later became like Naval History and Heritage Command many years later. And it was funny because I was reading that book as a little kid, and, it inspired me, among other experiences, to join the Navy. And part of what I did when I was down in Pensacola, I created a volunteer program for bringing people from, the training schools over there, and they could spend a day working on the battleship doing restoration work instead of calisthenics and running and screaming. And so that was great for them, but it was also great for the battleship because they got free labor, and it was great for the Navy because they got good publicity. And if I hadn't been really interested in like that World War II era of naval heritage, I'm not sure I would have, been gravitating towards the hour-long journey over to Mobile to work on the battleship Alabama and do restoration work. So that book not only did propel me into a naval career out of college, but sort of the character of my naval experience was even a little bit shaped by it. And you know how much I love history. So that's one of those books that helped me to love history. And then finally, I would say The Old Man and the Sea, because it's a short, easy book to read, but it's one of those things like Vanishing Point where you can read into it what you like. And what I read into it was that you're never too old to be strong, and you're never too vulnerable to fight back. That was a story about determination and character, and that man who was past his prime fought to the end, and he didn't even wind up with the trophy. By the end, the fish is eaten by sharks. He pulls up to the dock. There's nothing but a skeleton left. He doesn't have a trophy. He doesn't have a product to sell. He doesn't have a fish to eat. All he's got is his pride. And in the story, he looked to Joe DiMaggio as an inspiration. And I think it becomes very meta because as the reader of the story, I looked at that character and found a lot of inspiration.
I think when you read those kind of books at different ages, they mean different things. I think I read that for the first time when I was like 15 or something like that. And I didn't walk away with the same meaning from that book. And I've reread some of those kind of classics from that age when, you read them in high school or something like that, the great American novel or whatever it may be. And you just have different takeaways at different moments in your life of what you read into it, I suppose.
And that's the way it was written, because Hemingway was asked about it. He's like, the fish is a fish, the sea is the sea, and the rest is shit. There's nothing metaphorical about it. He kind of like spat on this whole like in-depth reflection I have on it. But
he was kind of a dick too.
He's just being a dick and a tough guy. He wants that image. He's too macho to say it's a thoughtful, introspective story. But yeah, no, I got a lot out of that. You can be a hero without a trophy, and that's sort of what I read into that old man and his struggle. And I think at any point in life, you still got the strength to rise to the occasion. And, that's what that book meant to me. And it might mean something different to you, and it might mean something different to Hemingway. But I think good literature always has that quality. So that would be my third favorite book.
Well, awesome, Tim. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for coming and visit. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Rob. I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.